when I got out of school, I moved to New York City and I wanted to be an illustrator. And I went around with an illustration portfolio and no one wanted to hire me. And I went to see one art director who told me if I wanted to be an illustrator, I had to write a children's book. So I went home and wrote one. And it was a story about animals moving into a brownstone building. And there was a bear, and the bear wanted to go to bed for the winter, but there was a cat who lived next door who wanted to be an opera singer, and she was keeping him up. And there was a whole series of moves in the building until it was resolved, and the book was called The Brownstone. And I wrote it, and I gave it to this children's book editor, and he lost it.
Oh,
He lost the manuscript, and he lost the drawings.
oh my gosh.
So I had to get a job, and I found a job that was an entry-level position at Random House, a book publishing company. And I was laying out in that company the insides of children's books. And I would do paste ups and mechanicals with the illustrations. So there'd be an illustration done by a famous illustrator like Richard Story, and then there'd be a line of type underneath it. And I would have to make the type straight, which I stunk at, by the way. And I used to smoke, you can tell by my voice. And nobody else on that floor smoked except for this one illustrator who used to come up. He was doing books for them, and his name was Stan Mack. He used to do the real life funnies in New York. And he would come into my little office, which was about as big as this table, and he would chisel my cigarettes. And he'd be doing that and talking to me while he was waiting to see his client. So in one of the discussions, I told him about the children's book that was lost that I did. And I told him what the plot was. And he said, well, show me where the animals moved. And I did like a cutaway of the building. And, I said, okay, this one moves next door to the cat, and the cat's an opera singer. And then the pigs are on this floor, and the mice are starving next door, and, stuff like that. And there was a landlord, and he moved all these guys around. And that he said, if I let him illustrate it, he'd sell the book for me. And he went around to an editor named Jane Fader, and he sold the book, I think, that day. It was really like, he went in with the story because it was a cutaway and the thing was kind of a natural, but I've never written another children's book since.
Wow.
But it was sort of an interesting accident. It was like this series of accidents that have happened to me through my life that are not things that I designed or planned, just sort of episodes that started to connect. So the way I got into the music business was that I had a boss named Herb Levitt, who was the guy who was my boss at Random House. And we were close, and I still know his kids. He was a very sweet man. And he used to work for my husband, who before he was my husband, he worked at Pushpin. So
Wow.
he didn't know he knew a little bit about me, but he knew a lot about Seymour. So he was nice to me. And then when I found out he got offered another job at an advertising agency, and there was no place for me there. So he said he would call up a friend of his who worked in the Columbia Records promotion department and see if they had a spot for me. So he called up a man named Teddy Bernstein, who in fact had a spot for me. And that's how I got into the music business. It was like just another one of these accidental situations. This guy had to leave. It probably meant that they'd redo the position and I'd lose the job. So he didn't want me to lose the job. So he found me another job. So I started doing ads for record covers, which was a very stupid job. But it was up in the music business, and I did ads for all kinds of people. I did Springsteen ads. I did Bob Dylan ads. I did things like that. And I wrote a book about this. The book is called Make It Bigger. And it was really about my experiences in the music business where they just wanted to make the logo bigger and bigger on things.
Right.
But the experience was such that I really did a lot of work, because you had to do them fast. You would get the ads, and the trade publications would close on Wednesday, and you'd get the ad format thing that they wanted you to work on Monday. So you had to write it and design it, lay it out, and then you had to close by the end of the day on Wednesday because it had to go to the trade magazines, which were Cashbox and Billboard, and sometimes you had longer if it was Rolling Stone. So I made all the crappy ads. And then I made a couple of good ones. And I made a couple of good ones, I think, after I was there about 2.5 years. And the art director of Atlantic Records called me up, a guy named Bob Defrin. And he asked me if I would be interested in coming to Atlantic because he liked the ads. Well, it happened. I went to Atlantic and the ads and the covers were done in the same department. So I got to work on record covers.
Wow.
I did, I think, 23 record covers at Atlantic in that
Wow.
year, and a
Wow.
bunch of them won awards. So John Berg, who was the design director of Columbia Records, called me up and made me East Coast art director and hired me back. So
Wow.
and all these things were completely, I mean, you win an award, your work gets seen. So there was that, but it was all just sort of happenstance. I didn't actually, except for the Random House job, which just happened to be available when I was walking around looking for work, is the only job I actually looked for. You know,
Well,
they
it's it sounds like it's all luck, but in some ways you co-created that, because along the way you're saying yes to things. You're saying, that doesn't feel right, this feels right, and you're open. The fact that you are so open to be and flexible to move from this to that to this is incredible. I mean, that
I was
really.
young. I mean, that's being young. Like
Yeah,
young, you
yeah.
don't care very much. Oh, I'll try that. Okay, that looks good.
Now the album covers, I mean, I grew up flipping through those album covers, right? I grew up standing at the record store, doing that flip, 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 going through, waiting to see what artwork jumps out at me. And so I remember, Boston and Cheap Trick and a lot of the things that you were that you were working on. And
I, I hated all that stuff. I mean, I rather like the Cheap Trick guys. Boston, I hated the cover.
oh,
Um,
interesting.
it was like they
Wow.
sort of forced me into it. They wanted to do something that was sort of like outer spacey things, and
Right.
we did this very pulp thing, which was the same artist, Roger Hyson, did these really beautifully rendered kind of comic book hero spaceships,
Yeah.
that said Boston on them, jamming into the people, and the people were running away like this.
Oh,
And he
right.
said, "No, you can't do that. The spaceships have to be saving the people." And I
Right.
said, "I don't know how the spaceships save the people." They said, "Well, so we had to figure out how do the spaceships save the people." And then we figure, okay, the Earth is blowing up and all these spaceships are leaving the planet to be safe. Okay. And the
Okay.
lead spaceship was Boston, and there were two other spaceships on it. And one said New York, and the other one said London.
Okay.
The big one in the front said Boston. And
Right.
then the album cover company wouldn't let me do it because people would think the title of the album was Boston, London, New York.
Oh, jeez.
And I thought, oh, this is stupid. They're little. That's big. And I thought it was a dumb cover, and I hated it. Then it sold 7 million records in 3 weeks,
Right. Right.
and I'm saddled with it for the rest of my life.
Oh my gosh. Now, what's interesting is that today we have a lot of young people going out and buying vinyl again. Vinyl
Right,
is taking off. People are buying vinyl who don't even have turntables, and
right.
they're partly because of that album cover. It
It's
is.
the objectness of it, and it was also the activity of it. Like what was so
Mm,
fantastic, and I I left the music industry actually when CDs came in because I didn't like that object. The record
mm,
cover was great, and a lot of what I did were some of them were open up covers, like the Bob
right,
James series, and they were
right.
kind of amazing. But it was the experience. If you were a music lover, and I certainly was for in that period of time, you would get the album, you really wanted to hear it, and you go home and you'd open it and you'd look at the cover and you'd read the liner notes while you were playing and listening to it. And it was really
Yeah.
part of the experience. It wasn't like
Yeah.
you were getting up and dancing, you were actually like discovering it.
Yep.
And it was a golden period of the music business. It was just
Mhm.
really, really amazing. And I have a lot of nostalgia for what that experience was. But the record industry was crazy. It was sexist. It was I
Mm.
don't know how to describe the kind of episodes that existed, but it was sort of like it would have made a great sitcom where
Good.
there's the beleaguered designers in the art department working away while these recording artists come up and say, we want a little like this and a little like that, maybe doing a dance and stuff like that. That's sort
Wow.
of what it was. That's what it was like. And there were famous characters who came in, sort of like cameo appearances by David Bowie or Paul McCartney, and that you could film that. That would have been great as a
That would have
series.
been great. Oh, that would have been awesome. How do you feel like that experience and working on album covers? Do you feel like that was influential? Was that important in the design that you've done for the past, well, it's now 40 plus years?
Well,
And
they were identities. They were
okay.
identities for music. I mean, you were people. Everybody knows what the Boston cover looks like. That's that band's identity.
Hmm.
The Bob James albums, which were all these big objects blown up out of scale. And he was like like not a very well-known jazz artist, but all the hip hop guys started sampling him.
Hmm.
And we made the records in series. He had a photographer before I did them who was Pete Turner, who designed his covers, and they were called 1, 2, 3, 4, and my first one was 5, and it was a different series, so we made them objects instead of numbers. And so I made a big nickel on the first record cover. Then there was a football for touchdown. It was called, and they were titled after that. So there was nickel, touchdown. I forgot what the great one. They were called different things,
Mm-hmm.
and what the hip hop guys did is they don't call them by the titles of the album. They call them the nickel, the football, the thing. They all call them by the object,
Right.
which is really really charming to me. That and they were that stuff started happening. I designed the covers in the 70s. I think from like 76 to 1980, I was doing those covers, and then the hip hop stuff was really late 80s, early 90s. So they were already remaking up what that was.
So the idea that these album covers are like brand identities
Yeah.
then turned into you doing brand identities, and you were, I mean, going from the music business out to CNN. I mean, out to much
I never
larger.
did see it. I never did CNN.
You
That's a
never did.
lie on the internet.
Oh, my mistake.
No, everybody's mistake.
You did
Somebody
a
stuck that
lot.
there.
You did a lot of identities. You've done a lot of identities though, over
Yes,
the years.
yes, I
And
have.
and so, what's your? Do you think that's similar in terms of understanding when you're creating an identity, a corporate identity, or back then an album identity? How are you approaching that? How are you? Where does that bubble up from? Are you thinking about the personality? Are you thinking about where does that? What's going on there?
Well, there are different genres, and there's a certain amount of expectation of the marketplace, and then there's the ability to push the marketplace, and that's what I'm more interested in than regurgitating what the expectation was. I mean, a lot of the record covers I did, and I did a lot of them, were photographs, and they were sort of formulaic, and they were repetitive, and they looked like other record covers. And then there were
Hmm.
record covers I did that were not. And what I really was excited about doing were not pop record covers. The reason I liked jazz so much was I could experiment with it, and I got very involved in typography. And at the end of my time at CBS, I had done a series of jazz covers that were printed on like paper bag stock, and they were called the Best of Jazz. And they had the artist sort of screened on the cover in flat black and white on this brown paper
Wow.
covers, and there was a very big poster that was done with it that had all their names of tangents, a little bit like constructivism, and the thing said the Best of Jazz, and that got into museums. Like that was sort of
Mm.
the first thing that I did that was beyond the record industry. It sort of went out into its own graphic design language, which is what I became interested in trying to achieve. You can't achieve it all the time, but sometimes you can break through the noise and invent a method and a basis that other people then emulate and follow, and then everybody's doing it. Nobody knows you did it anymore, and it becomes half-beat and tired. You got to do the next thing.
Well, it's like jazz, like poetry. You're pushing. I love that idea that you're pushing the language. You're using the language, and we're all using the same grammatical elements in design of color and shape and type and so on. But you're using it to push the language even further and further. That is a beautiful idea. So it begs the question. I have to ask you, if you had to choose one, if you had to start with one, color, shape, font, what would you choose? Where would you start if you're
I'd make it black and white, and it would be in wood type. You can't go wrong.
can't? Why wood type? Where does that come from?
It's powerful.
Wow, that's great. It is. It's well, and it's also going back to the idea of object. It is an object, right? There's still something
Yeah,
about a wood type and letterpress, which feels like this was created. This is analog creating analog.
it's tactile.
Yeah,
That the tactile is human.
I love that.
Computers are less human. Computers imitating wood type are viable. I do it all the time, but
Okay,
they're not as good as the real thing. The real thing was great.
that's great. Um, I actually have a bunch of wood type in my garage. I'm going to have to pull out and start stamping on things. Um, so you design. You don't do the computer stuff as much yourself. The pressing the
At
buttons
all.
and that
I don't
at
do it
all.
at all. I never learned how to do it. By the time the computer became a tool that we really worked with on a daily basis, not something that was a novelty. And as a matter of fact, the computer came in the late 90s, and I had a business in that period called Paula Scher.
Hmm.
No, it was 80s, late 80s, I'm sorry. So it was about 1988, 1989, and there was a guy who was renting some space from me named Randall Hensley, and he was a big computer buff, and I thought his design stunk. So I used to think it's because he's doing it on a computer and he doesn't have control of his choices. Because
Right.
the computer could at that point in time set a block of copy or set a word, but you couldn't turn it on its side. You had to print it out and then scan it back into the computer, which is
Right.
stupid. So I said, okay, here's the book jacket design, and we'll each do a mechanical for it, and I'll race you. Because all I had to do was cut it out and paste it. And this poor guy's printing it out and messing around. It was very funny. I remember that very well.
Wow.
But I couldn't. I really could never deal with a computer because it was too much like typing a design, and it wasn't drawing. That kids who got on there and worked. As a matter of fact, it was my class. I taught at SVA during that time. I taught from. I think I started teaching in 1981, and I taught for 39 years. And I hired a lot of my students, and there's a lot of dialogue about the technology. And I found that the students that I had, like Gail Anderson and Deb Bishop and Drew Hodges, and they all did really well, but they were not trained on the computer. They were hand workers. And then I got a group that were computer born when the computer couldn't do things.
Hmm.
And that was a failed generation. I mean, they really had a hard time adjusting because they were on a tool, and the tool couldn't do much. So they adjusted the way they began thinking about things in relationship to the tool. The next generation that came off, the software got better, and the
Hmm.
computers got better, and their work got better. But it was a really slow process. Now it's amazing. But at that particular point in time, you're trapped in the technology you really are trained with. That's why
Hmm.
I can't work on the computer. I really can't think that way.
How,
Um,
what do you do when you're working with designers today, with the production people today who are, if you're handing stuff off, how do you communicate to them, or how do you encourage them to stretch what they're doing?
I make sketches and I sit behind them and point.
And
Move that over there. Do you mind you make that bigger? Thing down there and move that a little to the left. Yeah, that'll do it. Add some more blue to the red. I mean, stuff
yep,
like that all day long.
all day long.
You-
I love that.
Olivia sees me do it.
So okay, so you're going to be speaking at the Design and Marketing Summit, which we're very excited about, and it's an honor to have you there. Can we talk a little bit about what you're going to be talking about, what you're going to be sharing with the Creative Pro audience at the Design and Marketing Summit?
Well, I thought I'd show maybe one or two demonstrations of things I've done along the way, and then what I'm doing now.
Talk.
And talk about some of the things I was just talking to you about. And
Mhm.
in the 80s, the work got very different because the work became. I was at that point in time. I was very involved in historic styles, and I did a lot of things that were really people criticized them as historicism because I was going back and using different fonts and things from history and that sort of thing. But I learned a lot from that. And when I joined Pentagram and I started doing much more identity work, and particularly the public theater, I began to really develop a way I continually work. Like it's sort of like figuring out what the spirit of something needs to be in relationship to what that person is doing, or figuring out the spirit of something, what the expectation is, and then turning that on its head. You can do that too. And then following that through and using is the technology as well as it can be used. So at this point in time, we're working with AI, and I have somebody who works with me who is a little genius and figured out how to make a whole illustration system of icons using this thing. That's amazing. I mean, so that, it's not different in thinking than the way I thought about making the very first ads I worked on. It's more that you can look at a piece of technology as an opportunity to move your work in a certain direction that you wouldn't have thought of doing without it.
I love that. So I'm curious though, if as you're thinking about designing identities, you've got the marketing department down the hall coming over and saying, "Yeah, but is it going to sell? Is that going to be? Is this? I mean, how do you work when you're coming from a pure design perspective and you're thinking about the spirit of the thing, which I love that idea? How do you deal with the folks in marketing who come over and they're yelling that you can't sell it because it has New York and London on the or DC on the cover? How do you deal with that problem of design versus marketing?
Well, it's always been there's always been that push pull, and it has to do with the goals of each thing. A marketing person is to a degree, unless they're a real savant, they're driven by numbers. In other words, they're looking at what is a population like? If there's an age range of people who buy this stuff, what do they want? If there is a color that's very popular right now, what is that color? If there is a methodology of communication, what are they doing on TikTok and blah blah? I mean that's sort of their concern.
Hmm.
The problem is that what that information tells you is what they like now. It doesn't tell you what they like in the future. A designer's issue is in both making something that might be palatable to the public as it exists now, but edges them into a different way of thinking. And that's very hard to achieve because there's always fear that's driving the process in relationship to the client. Like I want to go from here to here. And if I'm lucky, I can go from here to here.
Well, it's interesting the idea that design has a much longer
You
shelf life.
suppose the stuff's supposed to last 50, 60, 100 years.
Yeah.
I have,
Yeah.
there's a book on logo design that was done by Tash, and it's just amazing. It shows everything from, there are two volumes of it. I think the earliest one starts in like early 1800s to the 1900s, and then maybe even to 19, and then there's another one that goes from mid 1900s to 2000. And you see things that are much more contemporary than you think. I mean, and they're still around. Like the Audi logo, I think was designed in 1890. Yeah,
Wow.
right.
Wow.
What?
Wow.
I mean, it is amazing. I mean, check it out.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating. In some ways, the design, I mean, they designed the future. They designed the culture that we're living in today, the aesthetic that we're living in today, that story that's being told. I love
Oh,
that.
absolutely. I mean, and you accept it and you don't imagine that it could possibly be. I was shocked when I saw it.
Yeah, that's amazing.
There was
Well,
something else like that too. I mean, there are a lot of them. There are a lot of things that that were designed around the turn of the century and didn't date because that was really the beginning of modernism, and it started in mid Europe, in mostly in Germany. The French had much more of an illustrative basis, but then the British caught on really early. So when you look at the things and you go even to the early 1900s, like 1910 or before World War I, you're sort of shocked at what stuff looks like. Not all of it, some of it.
I'm laughing a little bit only because for you and me, the turn of the century, that phrase "turn of the century" means the
That
turn of into
century.
the 20th century. For a lot of people today, the turn of the century was just 25 years ago. Um, Listen, Paula, thank you so much for taking the time to get into this. I love this, and it's a real pleasure. And again, I'm so excited that you're going to be at the Design and Marketing Summit, and that we'll be hearing more from you because it's there's so much to learn, so much to learn.